Hidden in the shadows of history lies a trade few dare to speak of, older than the Atlantic slave ships, wider than the deserts they crossed, and lasting for over 1,000 years. Millions of souls were torn from their homelands, their voices silenced by sand and sea. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten Arab slave trade, its secrets, its horrors, and the untold human cost that still echoes in silence. Imagine the year is 1850. The scorching sun beats down on the Sahara. A long caravan winds across the dunes, hundreds of chained men, women, and children trudging barefoot through burning sand. Their lips crack with thirst, their backs whipped raw by guards on horseback. Many will never reach their destination. Some will collapse and be left to die, their bones swallowed by the desert. This is not the Atlantic Middle Passage you've heard about in school. This is another chapter of human suffering, one that stretched across Africa, the Middle East, and deep into Asia. It lasted not for a few centuries, but for over a millennium. And yet, why is it almost never spoken of? Why do we know of the plantations of the New World, but not the forgotten markets of Zanzibar, Basra, or Cairo? What you are about to hear is a hidden story of conquest and captivity, of power and silence. This is the story of the Arab slave trade they never talk about. When we hear the word slavery, most minds jump to images of ships crossing the Atlantic, of plantations in the Americas, of chains and cotton fields. And indeed, the transatlantic slave trade was one of the darkest crimes in human history. But centuries before Europeans began transporting Africans across the ocean, another trade was already thriving. For over 100 to 300 years, beginning as early as the 7th century and lasting into the 20th, slaves were captured, marched, sold, and transported through the Arab world. This system stretched from East Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Historians estimate that somewhere between 10 to 18 million people were enslaved through this network. Yet the Arab slave trade remains far less discussed. Why? Perhaps because its legacy is harder to trace. Descendants of those enslaved were often assimilated, erased, or silenced. Perhaps because the story doesn't fit neatly into the narratives of European colonialism we are more familiar with. Or perhaps because the wounds it left behind remain raw in the societies it touched. But ignoring this story does not make it disappear. Behind every number is a human life, a mother torn from her children, a boy taken across the desert, a girl forced into a harem, a soldier who fought in battles not of his choosing. Tonight, we will uncover this forgotten history, step by step. The Arab slave trade began with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. The early Muslim conquests spread rapidly across North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. In these expanding empires, slavery was not a new idea. It existed in Arabia before Islam, but the scale changed dramatically as territories grew. Captured prisoners of war became slaves. Markets in Mecca, Medina, and Damascus buzzed with trade. But soon, demand outstripped supply. Traders turned south, to the African interior. The routes were brutal. Across the Sahara, caravans stretched for miles. Imagine being shackled at dawn, forced to march under guards who carried whips and spears. Food was scarce. Water was life or death. Some accounts suggest that for every 10 slaves who started the journey, only 3 survived. And what awaited the survivors? Some were sold as domestic servants, cooks, or field laborers. Many women were forced into harems, serving the households of wealthy elites. Others were sent east to Iraq, Persia, and India. There, they worked as porters, pearl divers, and eunuchs. One group in particular stands out, the Zanj. These were East African slaves taken to southern Iraq in the 9th century to work in salt marshes. Conditions were brutal: sweltering heat, swamps filled with disease, and endless toil scraping salt from the earth. But the Zanj did not remain silent. In 869, they rose in one of the largest slave rebellions in history, the Zanj Rebellion. For nearly 15 years, tens of thousands fought against the Abbasid Caliphate. They captured cities, built fortresses, and threatened Baghdad itself. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but it revealed the simmering resistance beneath centuries of oppression. As centuries passed, the trade expanded further. From the Swahili coast of East Africa, dhows, Traditional wooden ships sailed across the Indian Ocean, carrying slaves to Arabia, Persia, and even as far as India and China. Picture the bustling port of Zanzibar, the salty air filled with shouts of traders. Arab merchants haggled with African middlemen who brought captives from the interior. Young boys, terrified, clutched each other's hands. Girls, barely teenagers, were inspected like property. The market thrived, fueled by demand for labor and concubines. The routes were vast. Across the Red Sea into Yemen and Mecca, through the Persian Gulf into Basra and Baghdad, across the Indian Ocean into Gujarat and beyond. Unlike the Atlantic trade, which was largely about plantation labor, the Arab slave trade had diverse purposes. Men were used as soldiers, guards, or porters. Women were primarily taken for domestic service or concubinage. Eunuchs, boys castrated before puberty, were in high demand for guarding harems. The procedure was so dangerous that many did not survive, making eunuchs rare and valuable commodities, and yet this trade left fewer visible descendants. Why? Because unlike in the Americas, where enslaved populations grew, the harsh conditions of transport, castration, and assimilation into local societies often erased entire bloodlines. Generations were swallowed whole. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a dominant power, and slavery was woven into its fabric. From Istanbul's Topkapi Palace to the markets of Cairo, slaves were bought and sold openly. African boys were taken as janissaries, trained to fight in the Sultan's armies. Women from Africa, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe filled harems across the empire. The Ottomans perfected the system, institutionalizing slavery in both war and peace, but the East African trade also boomed. From the 17th century onward, Zanzibar became the epicenter. The Sultan of Oman moved his capital to Zanzibar in the 1840s, turning it into the largest slave market in the Indian Ocean. Picture this scene, dawn at the Zanzibar market. A line of captives kneels in the dirt, their wrists bound. Traders in flowing robes inspect them like cattle, checking teeth, prodding muscles, deciding who is fit for labor and who will be sent to serve in households. The air stinks of sweat, fear, and salt from the nearby sea. From Zanzibar, ships carried thousands every year. Some went to Arabia, some to Persia. Others were marched north across the desert to Egypt and beyond. The demand never stopped. By the 19th century, European powers began to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. Britain outlawed it in 1807. The United States followed in 1808. Slowly, the Atlantic system collapsed. But in the Arab world, slavery persisted. In fact, in some regions, it expanded. In East Africa, ivory and slaves were traded side by side. Caravans cut deep into the continent, raiding villages in modern-day Tanzania, Mozambique, and the Congo. Captives were tied together with wooden yokes, forced to march hundreds of miles to the coast. Eyewitnesses describe the road littered with corpses. Those too weak to continue were abandoned. David Livingstone, the Scottish explorer, was horrified by what he saw in the 1860s. He wrote, "To overdraw its evils is a simple impossibility." And still, the markets thrived. In Zanzibar, slaves were sold under the shade of a giant tree in the heart of the city. Buyers inspected them, bargained, and carried them away. Many women vanished into harems. Many men died carrying loads of ivory or salt. The suffering was immense, but unlike in the Atlantic trade, where abolition movements gained momentum, here, silence reigned longer. British naval patrols in the Indian Ocean eventually fought to suppress the trade. But underground markets persisted well into the late 19th century. Even as the world moved into the modern age, the Arab slave trade did not vanish overnight. In some regions, slavery continued well into the 20th century. Saudi Arabia officially abolished it only in 1962. Yemen and Oman followed around the same time. In Mauritania, slavery was not formally criminalized until the year 2007. The shadow is long. Millions of lives were uprooted, yet their stories remain fragmented. In East Africa, the descendants of slaves, known as the Shirazi or other local names, still struggle with identity and belonging. In the Middle East, silence lingers. The memory is uncomfortable, buried beneath layers of denial, and yet the echoes remain. in the ruins of Zanzibar's slave market, now turned into a church, in the forgotten graves along the Saharan caravan routes, in the absence of family trees erased by assimilation and loss. The Arab slave trade was not identical to the Atlantic one. Each had its own horrors, its own dynamics, but both remind us of humanity's capacity for cruelty and the danger of forgetting. The Arab slave trade lasted for more than a millennium. It stretched across continents, touched millions of lives, and left scars that remain to this day. And yet it is a story often silenced. Perhaps because it is uncomfortable, perhaps because it challenges simple narratives of oppressor and oppressed. But history is never simple. To ignore one chapter is to risk misunderstanding the whole book. By remembering the Arab slave trade, we do not diminish the Atlantic story. We deepen our understanding of humanity's shared history of suffering and resilience. Think of the countless unnamed men who marched across the desert, their footprints erased by shifting sands. Think of the women whose voices were silenced inside palace walls. Think of the children who never had a chance to grow, their lives cut short before they began. Their stories matter, because when we remember, we restore dignity to those erased. When we acknowledge, we resist repeating the same mistakes. The past cannot be undone, but its lessons can shape the future. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: silence is dangerous. What is hidden festers. Only by shining light into forgotten corners can we hope to break the chains that still bind us, in prejudice, in denial, in willful ignorance. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence again. Like this video to help it reach more people. Subscribe to Forgotten Chains for more untold histories of struggle, betrayal, and survival. And share this video, because the voices of the forgotten deserve to be heard. If you want to dive deeper, check out our other episode on the Zanj Rebellion, one of the greatest uprisings in slave history. History is not just about kings and empires. It's about the millions of lives caught in their shadow. By remembering them, we give voice to the voiceless. This was the forgotten Arab slave trade they never talk about. And now, you know the story.